trade deals with the United States and India, an interest rate cut, and a major announcement on immigration policy. Probably been a good week for the Labour government, certainly better than many they've experienced over the last 10 months. To discuss that in the Downtown Den Politics podcast, it's me, Frank McKenna, and I'll be joined by Jim Hancock.
The return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Yay, it worked.
James, welcome back to the Den, and we've just been involved in a very wide-ranging discussion about our future relationship with the European Union with our friends at Best for Britain. If people wish to listen into that podcast, then it's in the usual place. You'll be able to find it in the previous episodes of this one. But we didn't want to take this week of all weeks without commenting on what has been a fairly momentous set of events for the British government. Started with significant deal, I would say, with the Indians in terms of a trade deal there. Quite significant in terms of the economic impact, but also in terms of signalling the government's perhaps newfound determination to get some of these deals over the line. And then a deal of sorts, I will put it no stronger than that, James, with Donald Trump's White House, because the detail of what's been agreed there didn't seem to be particularly clear. Although what has been agreed, and I think is useful for our manufacturing sector in particular, was the 0% tariffs on cars and steel, aluminium. That's important in terms of giving at least a short-term security to jobs in those particular sectors. So, Jim, what did you make of those trade deals?
Well, I think you're right to reduce some of the more florid language that's been used, and our good friend Peter Mandelson. And there's always this danger, and I think Peter slightly fell over the edge on this. I don't want to overemphasize it. There's always this business about fawning to the Americans. I don't think that goes down particularly well with the British people, and certainly won't go down particularly well with certain sections of the Labour Party. But I think the broader point, my feeling is that, as we frequently discussed, that the first 6 to 8 months of the Labour government ain't been great, partly because of a lack of message, and that's partly because that then led to a lack of forward momentum. One almost felt as if the wheels were just spinning in terms of trying to get things going. In the last week or so, too late for the local elections, of course, there just is a sense of a bit more vision, a bit more forward motion, and actually getting any sort of trade deals done with India and with the United States, I suppose, shows that the Labour government is beginning to make its mark. And obviously we can analyse the details of it and its shortcomings. And as people will be able to hear on what I thought was an excellent podcast with our friends from Best for Europe, that overwhelmingly our best interests are in getting a trade deal with the European Union in terms of its impact on the GDP of the UK, whereas America, the best will in the world, it's fairly small, but because we have a fairly balanced budget with the United States. So that's a plus, along with, which we may come on to discuss, other things in the wind for Labour, which is this immigration stance that they're taking, because as I've frequently made the point, carrying on as we are, the disconnect between the Red Wall and Labour's traditional supporters and their new North London friends is just going to be disastrous.
I think the optics are important as well, aren't they, around these things? So whereas you and I will trawl over the detail of what these trade deals will actually deliver, in the outside world, voters just see Keir Starmer first in the queue to be signing a deal with Donald Trump, and that in itself will be seen as a positive. And I think it's fair to say, Jim, isn't it, that if he's been struggling on the domestic agenda, on the international stage, Starmer really has been very prime ministerial and restored the UK's reputation as far as the international community is concerned.
Yes, I mean, we all remember ever before Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, when he was Foreign Secretary, he really diminished this country's reputation in the world for being, putting it broadly, the United Kingdom was sometimes seen as a little dull and cautious and that sort of thing, but always reputable, always seeking for cooperation between the nations, and with a vast experience from our imperial history of international affairs and taking a broad view. That was damaged by Boris Johnson, both when he was Foreign Secretary and as Prime Minister. So you have got a sort of restoration of that sort of integrity, added to which, I think it's helping our relations with Europe that we are, although our defence budget has been slashed, we are still a major military power in these very troubled times. Frankly, other countries need our support, and him and John Healey. I think John Healey's role as Defence Secretary in this shouldn't be overlooked. I think the pairing there is pretty good. Not quite so sure about the Foreign Secretary David Lammy's role in all this, but you're absolutely right that and then if our Prime Minister is seen to be an influential figure in the world, that this is what the British people want to see, and I think that's helped as well.
Yeah, soft power is important, and of course India, again, one of the fastest growing economies, indeed projected that in 30 to 40 years' time, India's economy will be bigger than that of the United States. So getting a trade deal done with them was very, very good news for the government too. And let's put this into context. The Conservative government were trying to do a deal with the United States, firstly with Trump back in 2009, 2020, and then, of course, with the Biden administration, which was always going to be tough because Biden was less sympathetic towards the UK than perhaps Trump is. Trump does have this aberration, whether it's based on his love of the royal family, whether it's his mum's apparent affection for the UK, doesn't much matter. But India, that, Jim, is a big prize because, as I say, that is the fastest growing economy, I think I'm right in saying, among the G7 countries now.
Yes, and that it is really important because we always tend to talk about the United States and Europe, and without looking at exactly what you're saying, they are a fast-growing economy with a massively growing middle class who want to buy the sort of goods, the high-end goods that we produce. So there's a potential commonality there. But I don't know a vast amount about this, but from people I read about, doing deals with India is very difficult. They are quite protectionist. They look after their own interests. So getting any deal at all is vital. Now, of course, there's been a lot of publicity about this national insurance relief for Indians coming here and comparing that with, just as we're putting extra national insurance burdens on British business, we're going to be giving a free pass, or this is the interpretation of it. So these things are quite tricky, but I think...
But that's a load of bollocks, don't you, Jim?
But please correct...
You're not stupid.
No, correct it. Please do.
Well, every trade deal that we do with every single country in the world actually has that particular clause inserted into it, because otherwise people would be paying twice. Because, of course, the only Indian people working in the UK who will be excluded from paying national insurance will be those people who are here on temporary contracts. Doesn't apply to every single Indian person who's working in the UK. And although I expected Reform to come out with that crap, I thought it was absolutely outrageous and telling of where the Conservative Party is for Kemi Badenoch to join in with that particular chorus of crap. And then for it to be pointed out by the Indian Foreign Minister that it was Kemi Badenoch who'd actually signed up to that particular aspect of the agreement. Things just go from bad to worse to her. But let me just be clear to listeners, every single trade agreement we do has the same implication as far as national insurance contributions are concerned. And just to put this into more fuller context, if you are a Brit and you go to India to work on a temporary contract, then likewise, your national insurance contributions will be waived in India because you will be paying them here. So that is the fact. But the point that I think is important here is that you've picked that up as a problem. And the government, how many times do we have to say this? Communication, so important. And it took them a day to be able to explain that one away, by which time the hares are off running. And people have got this idea in their head that this in some way is a unique and strange occurrence. Never was, never will be. But I'm with you, Jim, in terms of saying to Labour, you've got to get that message across more clearly. Otherwise, the likes of reform have a field day.
Yes. That is very important. I mean, the Conservatives are finding it difficult to know how to react to these trade deals because, as you said, they were unsuccessful in doing them, and just saying it's sort of cola light or whatever it isn't going to fix it. So they really are still reeling from the local election results, and reform us to some extent making hay. But if we're broadening this out a little bit about ignorance about things, Reform UK, for instance, making a big thing about how they're going to resist having immigrants in hotels and so on. It was quickly exposed that they're unaware of the fact that actually county councils have no role in that. It's a relationship between the Home Office and Circa, whoever providing the service.
Yeah, I'm not sure that matters much. I think we said last week the smart politics are in that, really. So the thing that outrages me more than anything else in terms of the situation with immigration is the fact that we're basically paying fortunes for hotels to house asylum seekers. Not great for the asylum seeker. Anybody who spends any amount of time in hotels knows that it's a miserable existence if you've got to be there for more than 2 or 3 days, never mind months on ends. This idea that living in a hotel is some sort of luxury, well, not for me, I'm afraid. But the cost of it, Jim, the contracts that we've signed, and again, this is down to the previous government, and the point that the guys from Best for Britain were making there, immigration spiked because of Brexit. We were unable to recruit the workers we needed from the EU, and so we were then having to allow people from all over the world to come into the UK in a very uncontrolled fashion. And as I say, some of these deals that have been done with hoteliers, I read in the Sunday Times yesterday, one of these guys has become a billionaire on the back of housing asylum seekers in hotels. Absolutely outrageous. So I think it's smart politics, whether or not they can directly do anything to stop those hotels housing asylum seekers. I think what it has done, though, is it's got Yvette Cooper and the Home Office looking very carefully at some of those contracts that have been signed by their predecessors.
Yes. On Starmer's major speech, which has literally been made within the last hour, so you and I haven't had full chance to digest it, the language was quite impressive. I still don't see how he's going to stop the boats coming across the channel. Obviously ending the permits for care workers is one thing, although immediately the care industry is in despair. And we have a major issue here, and I want to try and put delicately the point I want to make. The fact of the matter is that UK citizens, unemployed people in this country, are not attracted to the very personal services that care workers have to give to the very elderly and incontinent and things like that. I don't often hear it expressed like that, but there's something in this. And it's going to be very interesting to see how the care industry is impacted by this. But clearly Labour have been spooked by reform success, and they're determined to try and do something. But I keep on coming back to it. Without doing something about those boats, reform is still going to get some benefit from it.
Yeah, I think in the end, though, we've got to try and get the message across that people coming across on the boats are 0.00004% of the immigrants that we have to deal with in this country. So I understand, again, the optics of that. People coming across on boats looks terrible, but that's not the major problem. The major problem in the immigration system has been the failure to process applications. And this was a deliberate policy started by the George Osborne government on the basis that if you delayed processing applications, then it would deter people from coming to the UK. That didn't happen. And so what you ended up with is this huge backlog of people who still haven't been processed. I think the key thing that was announced as part of the legislation that's been brought forward is this tweaking of the interpretation of the ECHR and the ability for the government to be able to deport people who are immigrants living in this country legally, but who break the law. That is, again, something that drives people mad, James. However sympathetic and liberal you are, you and I wouldn't think that it was right that people could continually break the law, living here as a migrant, and not face the consequences of that because there are things within the Human Rights Act that enables them to stay. And Yvette Cooper, again, was very clear over the weekend to say she expects that legislation to pass and then judges to apply the law as our government sees fit.
Yes, well, it's very interesting. I was talking to a fairly senior source in the Labour Party over the weekend, and I detect a desire to push back against the ECHR, and not necessarily to leaving it, but the people that run the ECHR and the judges would do well to recognise that some of the interpretations that are being put upon the ECHR are causing huge embarrassment in this country. And, obviously judges will always say they're not political, but we all know that people have to take into account the climate. And this ridiculous interpretation of this, wonderful treaty that was drawn up to protect refugees after the war and all that sort of thing is being misinterpreted at the moment. And I think you'll see, a readiness by Labour ministers to push back against that, and that may be the way through. What did you make of Yvette Cooper's reluctance to put a target on immigration? Because immediately Reform have said, it must be a zero, balance between immigrants and emigrants, and they want a zero. I think the Conservatives are somewhere near that. Labour are reluctant to do that because they say every other target's always been breached and never achieved.
Yeah, I think they're right. I think targets are, it's finger in the wind with this sort of stuff, isn't it? And the target they have set that everyone's talking about, they're likely to miss, which is the 1.5 million homes that they want to build by the time of the next election. I can't quite see how they're going to be able to deliver that. So I think they're right in terms of saying that. The important thing will be to get the number down, and to get the number down significantly. And if people see the dial move on that, I think that they will have done their job. If, as you say, people are still worried about the minority, very great minority of people who come across on boats and don't then feel that this is an instinctive thing, Jim, isn't it? People at the moment are feeling as though there are too many immigrants coming into the country. And so Labour's got to change that feeling, change that gut instinct. If they do that, targets, do they really matter? I don't think so. I don't think for the people out there that is the big issue.
And for people who perhaps haven't been able to or aren't going to listen to our excellent thing with our friends from Best in Europe.
Best for Britain.
Best for Britain.
Not Best in Europe.
I'm anticipating the Eurovision Song Contest.
Freudian slip.
Yeah, is the effect of Brexit was to stop European, who are often brickies and people like that, coming to this country to build the houses, and Boris Johnson having to go for people from the wider world whose skills wouldn't necessarily be in that area. What an irony of the whole Brexit effect. But I mean, this is the issue in terms of housing. I think probably unemployed British people would more desire to build houses than to perhaps work in social care. I don't want to sound unkind about this, but these seem to be the realities of it. How are we going to get the brickies to actually build the houses, the plumbers, the electricians, and so on? We need to be training them really fast.
Sometimes it's the unintended consequences that come back to bite governments on the bum. And of course, just in the way that Brexit created a spike in immigration, which was the exact opposite of what was expected, you've already got the care sector, for one, screaming about the changes that are being proposed by Vet Cooper. And as much as people want to see a reduction in immigration, I wonder what the reaction will be if there are a succession of care homes closing down because they simply can't employ staff. You can't force people from the UK to do these jobs. Same with fruit picking. The farmers were complaining, weren't they? Last year before, we can't get people to pick fruit. Hospitality sector. Our people, the UK, indigenous community, do not necessarily wish to take these jobs. And so it's a really difficult balancing act for the government to get. But
well, it's a challenge for reform, isn't it? Our reform saying that they would haul people in, cut their benefits, saying you, Frank McKenna, have refused to go and pick fruit or to work in a care home. Your benefit, unless you take one of those jobs within a month, your benefits are going to start to be cut. I mean, nobody ever talks about challenges reform on what the ultimate reality of their tough stance is on these things, because that's what it would require. And then we come to civil liberties and what the British people are prepared to accept. There are ways of almost forcing people to do things, but they're well beyond the scope of political dialogue that I ever hear.
But I think that as well will depend on the industry and the sector you're talking about. You wouldn't want somebody to be press ganged into looking after your elderly relative,
Yes,
would you?
No.
Forcing people into a field to pick fruit, then, that'd have Farage and his mates quite happy. But saying to those same people, well, there's a guy in there who's looking after your elderly mum who doesn't really want to be looking after your elderly mum, that's a different matter, isn't it?
You're absolutely right. And we, many stories of horrible behaviour in care home. I mean, the vast majority of people in care homes behave very well, but we know repeated cases where there has been terrible bullying and so on. It's a very big issue.
The conundrum will continue on immigration. As I say, my view is that if Labour can get this narrative that they are tackling the problem in a sensible and determined way, and the numbers do start to decrease, then they'll be okay. The biggest issue still facing the government, and this is what will decide as to whether they're re-elected in 2029 or not, is the economy. And there was some good news for Labour on this as well this week, which was a reduction in interest rates by 0.25%. I heard my good podcast colleagues, Jim, George Osborne and Ed Balls, wondering whether or not the Bank of England should have gone further.
Well, there were votes. Surprisingly, we actually get the vote, don't we? And we don't know that. I think a couple of people did want a bigger cut, and I think there will be along fairly soon. I mean, this goes to the other thing we don't want to overdo the optimism for the government, but they do make the point, although not sufficiently in our opinion. The messaging is still poor, but the minimum wage came in at the beginning of April and will begin to feed through. Interest rate cuts, maybe business will stop feeling hammered and will start to respond to that. This is the question. I mean, it is difficult because once a government gets a reputation, it is sometimes difficult to turn the tanker around. But this is what Rachel Reeves must be desperately hoping for during the course of this summer, so that by the autumn she can present a more positive budget.
Yeah. Well, trade deals, an interest rate cut, and as I say, a big announcement on immigration. Not a bad week for the government, I would suggest. Not as great, I would say, for Zelensky and Ukraine, who've been press ganged into going across to, I think it's Turkey, to meet with the Russians and start to discuss a peace deal without a ceasefire being implemented. Jim, seems to me Putin is basically running rings around Donald Trump and the White House. It's just disgraceful, really, isn't it?
It is extraordinary because Donald Trump's whole shtick is that he's the powerful guy, the man who does the deals, the man who's in control. And yet you're absolutely right. And I am genuinely shocked that, that Trump has forced Zelensky into this. I thought their relations were improving a bit after that awful White House debacle. But I mean, Zelensky said, and there was this sort of alleged truce during the 9th of May celebrations in Russia for the ending of the Second World War 80 years ago. There was a sort of diminution to some extent in the firing, and that what he said, let's carry that on while these talks are going on, not unreasonable. I mean, the idea that today, tomorrow and Thursday, while Zelensky's having to go to Turkey, that his country is continuing to be shelled is unconscionable, frankly. And I'm quite surprised. Apparently, these talks in Turkey are going to be face to face, and there's even talk that Putin and Zelensky will personally meet. I mean, that's not normally the way things are done, apart from the incredibly difficult optics of that for the two men. Personal relations are zero. I mean, normally both sides talk, and then if there's a deal to be done, finally the principals arrive and sign the deal. I don't quite understand this, but Zelensky's being put in a very difficult position, and also it's quite a snub because you've rightly referred to Keir Starmer, taking a leadership role in Ukraine. Well, he turned up with the Western leaders on Saturday to sort of counter what had gone on in Red Square. And they made it quite clear that a ceasefire was essential to any peace talks. And to some extent, Trump has embarrassed Sir Keir Starmer by insisting on this particular thing. I'm not optimistic for it, to be quite frank. Unless Trump is prepared to now, because we did hear this, didn't we? That Trump was getting exasperated with Putin, and yet another twist. He's back down again, and we're all over the place. I mean, the world picture is incredibly troubled at the moment. I mean, there are one or two positive signs. I mean, the India-Pakistan thing, the cricket seems to be going to be resuming, so perhaps that's cooling down. The Kurds have called a ceasefire after 40 years of fighting for their independence with Turkey. Trump apparently has negotiated directly with Hamas to get an American hostage out, and that might help there. But things are moving so fast, aren't they? And it's so unpredictable with Trump.
Yeah, I just think Putin, as I say, has played a blind as far as this is concerned. So he's split the NATO countries away from the States, hasn't he? So as you say, the European leaders were saying we've got to insist on a ceasefire before negotiations start. Putin then says, cleverly, well, I want to meet now directly with Zelensky and discuss a peace deal. And Trump wades in on the side of Putin and says, yeah, you've got to get this done. Very, very disappointing as far as we're concerned in terms of the Americans' attitude. But I've never bought this idea that Donald Trump is pissed off with Putin. I think that was just for show. I think that from all the words that we see and actions that Trump has taken, that actually he's a big admirer of the Russian president. And I think he'd like to be him, to be fair. He'd like to have the same sort of autocracy in the United States, and he's doing his best to get it as well.
Well, the other thing we ought to mention, of course, is that the Chinese tariff thing seems to have cooled. That is important.
I reckon there's a deal on the way.
Yes, for much lower tariffs. I mean, it's, Putin, I'm interested in your reaction to this. Trump will say, there you are, you see, I brought China to the negotiating table by putting up absurdly high tariffs. So I don't know whether that'll work in Trump's favour.
And it may do, I think, to his base, certainly. But if you listen to people who know better than I on these matters, they will say that the actions that Trump took on tariffs will have much longer term implications for the American economy. It'll take a long time for them to recover. And as we do know, because of our own experience with Brexit, your reputation takes a bit of a hiding when these things happen. And so the trust that people have in the United States, and going back to that deal of sorts that Keir Starmer has managed to secure with Trump, clever that we've managed to get 0% tariffs on a cap of 100,000 cars for the United States to sell over there, because that is apparently the amount of cars that we sell over there on an annual basis. So that was a good deal. But it's not worth the paper it's written on, really, is it? Because Trump just cannot be trusted.
Yeah. And, the British agriculture industry, which isn't best pleased with the Labour government at the moment, is concerned about this beef imports we're going to have. They're not hormone treated and so on, but we are giving access to the United States. And, they have an awful lot of beef in America. And the fear of British farmers is that they'll just be undercut by cheaper American beef.
Yeah, possibly. I'm not convinced again. Would you be buying beef from the States? I wouldn't. Go to your local butchers, buy British. That's my advice. And, I'm not sure again that, on the broader picture, that's going to impact greatly on Starmer. I think the message is more positive, isn't it, in terms of that deal? But there are, as I say, in the wider world, I think people look at the United States now as an unstable nation. And again, I think President Xi will tell you that it's Trump that has come to him to do a deal with China, not the other way around, because it sounded to me as though the United States were on the verge of empty shelves as well as higher prices. And Donald Trump telling all the little girls in America that they needed to have fewer dolls. I mean,
well, yes.
Good luck to him telling my kids that when they were little, I'll tell you.
Well, indeed. My younger son had 30 teddies, and my granddaughter has a similar number. I was talking to her about this the other day, and the trouble with my younger son was he had to say goodnight to them all every night. And so we introduced a very tough regulation which said 5 a night. So a complicated rota was set up. Sorry, I completely digress.
Well, the problems that Donald Trump set himself there, then. That's for sure. Right, well, we've covered an awful lot in a short period of time, Jim, and it's been great to catch up with you. Our colleague Joe Phillips, I think, may well be back with us next week, and we will see what happens with those talks with Ukraine and Russia in Turkey on Thursday. And of course, next week, we'll see that EU-UK summit. As I've mentioned a couple of times, we've just done a 45-minute special with Best for Britain, going through the detail of what the results of that summit may be. So if you are interested in what the future relationship with the EU and the UK will be, please take a listen to that. In the meantime, have a great week. Jim and I will see you next Monday. Cheers, guys.
Bye. Bye.